y'all, it's me, it's Dr. G, and welcome back to Star-Spangled Studies. In our last episodes, we navigated the turbulent waters of Reconstruction, we witnessed the industrial growth, we even headed out west, but today, we're going to plunge headfirst into the life in industrial America. Mark Twain named it the Gilded Age, not for its golden core, but for its glittering, often deceptive surface that held over the rotten underneath. This is life in industrial America. So let's go. So picture this. It's 1899, and the British author and renowned poet Rudyard Kipling arrives in the growing, bursting city of Chicago. He sees a city, quote, captivated by technology and blinded by greed, a huge wilderness buzzing with raw energy. He describes, quote, scores of miles of these terrible streets and their 100,000 of these terrible people, end quote. The spectacle, he confessed, quote, impressed me with a great horror. There was no color in the street and no beauty, only a maze of wire ropes overhead and dirty stone flagging underfoot. End quote. Yet when his cabman pointed to these very things as proof of progress, Kipling heard Americans echo this sentiment, believing, quote, that the mere fact of spiking down strips of iron to wood and getting a steam and iron thing to run along them as progress, that the telephone was progress, and that the network of wires overhead was progress, end quote. The American definition of progress was so much tied to the tangible and to the technological, and is one side of the story that I will be telling today. The other is captured by what a Danish immigrant and journalist Jacob Riis had described. In his landmark 1890 work, How the Other Half Lives, I've talked about this before, Riis turned his camera and pen to the squalor of New York City's tenements. He wrote, quote, long ago it was said that one half of the world does not know how the other half lives. That was true then. I don't know because I did not care. The half that was on top cared little for the struggles and less for the fate of those who were underneath, so long as it was able to hold them there and keep its own seat, end quote. The term Gilded Age, given to us by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner, perfectly encapsulates this duality. It wasn't an age of pure gold, but one where a thin, glittering layer of wealth, technological marvels, and opulent displays often masked deep-seated social problems. Problems like grinding poverty, rampant corruption, and profound inequality. Kipling's progress and Riis's other half existed side by side, creating the central tension of American life in industrialized cities. Understanding this era means constantly peeling back that gilded surface to examine the complex realities beneath. These were the very issues that would later ignite the fires of the progressive era that we'll look at in a future episode, a period of reform born directly from the unresolved crises of this gilded, glittering, rotting, troubled age. The late 19th century was an age of mechanical wonders, an era where inventions seemed to accelerate daily, reshaping the very fabric of American life. At the forefront of this transformation were the railroads, as we've discussed before. They were more than just modes of transport. They were, as our textbook describes them, quote, the first significant concentrations of capital, spawning the first massive corporations, end quote. By 1880, railroad track mileage in the U.S. had tripled since 1860, and it would double again by 1920. These iron roads crisscrossed the nation, annihilating, quote, the vast geographic barriers that had so long sheltered American cities from one another, end quote. It knitted together, quote, urban consumers and rural producers into a single, integrated national market, end quote. Historian Richard White captured the sheer scale of this change when he wrote, quote, If a Western Rip Van Winkle had fallen asleep in 1869 and awakened in 1896, he would not have recognized the lands that the railroads had touched. Bison had yielded to cattle. Mountains had been blasted and bored. Great swaths of land that had once whispered grass now screamed corn and wheat." End quote. This vivid image underscores not just progress, but also the often brutal reshaping of the American landscape. If railroads were the arteries, steel was the backbone of this new industrial economy. The invention of the Bessemer process in 1856 revolutionized steel production, making it vastly cheaper and more abundant. Suddenly, steel wasn't just for cutlery, it was for towering skyscrapers, sprawling bridges, more durable rails, and powerful new machinery. American steel production skyrocketed, eventually by the end of the century, surpassing that of Britain, France, and Germany combined. And no figure embodied this rise of steel better than a man we've talked about before, Andrew Carnegie, an immigrant who rose to become the titan of the industry. Carnegie was also a vocal evangelist for the American progress. In his 1885 essay, The Triumph of America, he declared, quote, "The old nations of the earth creep on at a snail's pace. The republic thunders past with the rush of the express," end quote. Later, in his Gospel of Wealth, in your textbook reader, he acknowledged the vast disparities that this progress created. Quote, "The contrast between the palace of the millionaire and the cottage of the laborer with us today measures the change which has come with civilization," end quote. Yet, he still argued, quote, "This change, however, is not to be deplored, but welcomed as highly beneficial. Much better this great irregularity than universal squalor," end quote. Carnegie's words reveal a common Gilded Age justification for inequality. It was the natural, even necessary price for such progress. The age, though, was also the age of electric dreams. Thomas A. Edison, the Wizard of Menlo Park, announced his ambitious pursuit of electric power and lighting in 1878. His perfection of a practical incandescent light bulb in 1879 was a watershed technological moment. On September 4th, 1882, when Edison's system illuminated the New York Times building, the newspaper heralded that, quote, "Mr. Edison had at last perfected his incandescent light," end quote. Another contemporary account from the New York Herald in December of 1879 described the glow of Edison's early public demonstrations as, quote, "like the mellow sunset of an Italian autumn," end quote. Electric light fundamentally altered daily life in cities, granting, quote, "complete control over lighting inside their homes and workplaces at the click of a switch," end quote. It was independence from the sun's daily rhythms. Night was no longer a barrier to activity. Factories could operate anywhere at any hour. George Westinghouse's development of alternating current, AC, was also crucial, allowing electricity to be transmitted over greater distances and enabling its widespread adoption. In factories around the country, electric motors untethered machines from centralized steam engines and belt systems, allowing for more efficient layouts and boosted productivity. Edison himself proclaimed, quote, "My desire is to do everything within my power to free people from drudgery and create the largest measure of happiness and prosperity," end quote. Yet, while new electric appliances like irons and washing machines promised to ease domestic labor, the ability for factories to run around the clock often meant longer, more grueling hours for the workers within them. It didn't make their lives happier. It might have made their lives worse. However, the wonders themselves just kept coming. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell patented the telephone. Its adoption was swift, from nearly 49,000 homes in 1880 to almost 600,000 by 1900, and a staggering 5.8 million just 10 years later. The telephone, quote, "quickened the social and economic life of the nation," end quote, revolutionizing business and personal communication. It also opened new employment avenues, particularly for women as switchboard operators. While some, like President Rutherford B. Hayes, were initially skeptical, reportedly asking, quote, That's an amazing invention, but who would ever want to use one of them, end quote. Well, others, like British reporter Kate Field in 1878, foresaw its profound impact, even predicting a future where, quote, while two persons hundreds of miles apart are talking together, they will actually see each other, end quote. Seems like she was onto something. These technological marvels, railroads, steel, electricity, the telephone, were undeniably transformative. They built a modern America, fostered unprecedented economic growth and national interconnectedness. However, this progress was a double-edged sword. The same innovations that created fortunes and convenience for the upper classes also concentrated corporate power and birthed new, often exploitative systems of labor, and they intensified the pace of work. The rise of massive corporations and significant concentrations of capital set the stage for trusts and monopolies that would dominate the economic landscape. The new means of production spawned a more permanent working class, as fewer individuals could aspire to economic independence, fueling the growth of organized labor to fight for their rights. The very technologies promising liberation could also become the tools of intensified production and control, managed by a new class of trained bureaucrats and salaried managers who oversaw these vast industrial enterprises. This was the complex reality of progress in industrial America. As industry boomed, American cities swelled, acting as powerful magnets for capital and, crucially, for the labor. This era witnessed one of the largest waves of immigration in American history, a demographic shift that profoundly reshaped the nation. Industrial capitalism, as our textbook notes, quote, was the most important factor that drew immigrants to the United States between 1880 and 1920, end quote. They were fleeing poverty, crop failures, land and job shortages, raising taxes, famine, political persecution, religious persecution, like Jews escaping pogroms in Russia. They were pulled by the promise of economic opportunity, factory jobs, the dream of freedom, and they were often beckoned by letters from relatives who had already immigrated to the United States. This wave brought a noticeable shift in origins. While earlier immigrants hailed primarily from Northern and Western Europe, Germans, Irish, British, Scandinavians, the new immigrants of the late 19th century and early 20th century predominantly came from Southern and Eastern Europe. This composed of Italians, Greeks, Poles, Russians, and various Slavic peoples, as well as a significant number of Jews. Asian immigration on the West Coast, primarily Chinese, had been significant, especially in the West Coast, until discriminatory laws, began to curtail it. Between 1817 and 1900 alone, nearly 12 million immigrants arrived. Rose Cohen, a Russian Jewish immigrant, captured this mix of hope and disorientation upon arriving in New York in her memoir, which is in your textbook reader. Describing her first steps into a tenement, she wrote, quote, "Here the door was open, but the passage was dark. A band of light came from a door at the side, and we walked towards it. A few steps led us into a large, bright kitchen with a red floor. My heart warmed to the red floor. It was like home," end quote. The search for a semblance of home amidst the overwhelming strangeness of a new land was a universal immigrant experience. These newcomers overwhelmingly flocked to urban centers, newcomers like my grandfather. Cities like New York and Chicago experienced explosive growth. By 1900, an astonishing, quote, 80% of Chicago's population was either foreign-born or the children of foreign-born immigrants, end quote. New York City's Lower East Side became, quote, the most densely packed urban area in the world, end quote. This rapid urbanization transformed the physical landscape. Steel-framed skyscrapers began to pierce the skyline for the first time, a testament to the new industrial prowess, the strength of steel, And mass transit systems now were laying down miles of tracks for trolleys, for cable cars, and eventually subways. And they were to be put into place to move this large population to and from work. Yet, for many, the urban reality was far from glamorous. Rudyard Kipling, with his characteristic mix of awe and disdain, described Chicago's terrible streets and its hundreds thousands of terrible people, a huge wilderness that was simultaneously somehow presented as proof of progress. But let's talk about the urban poor for a minute. The most common dwelling for the urban poor and the newly arrived immigrants were tenement housing. Jacob Riis, in his How the Other Half Lives, exposed the grim reality of living in tenements. Tenements were, in his words, quote, narrow, low-rise apartment buildings, usually grossly overcrowded, often cramped, poorly lit, underventilated, and usually without indoor plumbing, end quote, making them, quote, hotbeds of vermin and disease, end quote. By 1900, Riis reported that, quote, 3/4 of its people, and he's talking about New York City, live in the tenements. The 15,000 tenement houses that were the despair of the sanitarian in the past generation have swelled into 37,000, and more than 1,200,000 persons call them home, end quote. He starkly labeled them, quote, hotbeds of the epidemics that carries death to rich and poor alike, the nurseries of pauperism and crime, end quote. Some buildings packed as many as 18 people into a single apartment, and many families were forced to do piecework like assembling garments within these same cramped, unhealthy spaces. Such conditions were breeding grounds for diseases. Epidemics of cholera, typhoid fever, tuberculosis, dysentery, and diphtheria swept through urban slums, facilitated by, quote, overcrowding and poor housing served by inadequate or non-existent public water supplies and waste disposal systems, end quote. Infant mortality rates were devastatingly high. In late 19th century cities, nearly 1 in 4 babies died before their first birthday. Sanitation overall was a nightmare, and that's putting it nicely. One account describes city streets, quote, horse manure piled up in the streets, sewage flowed through open gutters, and factories spewed foul smoke in the air. Without dependable trash collection, people dumped their garbage on the streets, end quote. You can just imagine the smell of being in the city and why people would want to leave it as best they possibly could. Sewage often contaminated drinking water sources in a situation like this, as private cesspools overflowed and old sewer lines discharged directly into the rivers, causing even more disease. The sheer scale of this public health crisis forced a response. A growing understanding that disease was linked to environment, not just individual morality, spurred reform efforts. People used to believe that if you were a bad person, you got a disease. That's not the case anymore. Cities began to invest in, quote, better sewers, water purification, and trash removal, end quote, to combat this problem. Water filtration systems were introduced in the 1870s, followed by chlorination in 1908. New York City passed a law in 1879 mandating minimum plumbing and ventilation standards for new tenements, though early designs like the dumbbell tenement often proved problematic, with air shafts becoming refuse dumps. A significant figure in the sanitation reform was Colonel George E. Waring Jr., who, as New York City's street cleaning commissioner from 1895, modernized the department. He banned large-scale ocean dumping of refuse and instituted a system of recycling, with ashes taken to landfills and animal waste rendered for fertilizer. His white wings, or the uniformed street cleaners, became symbols of this new commitment to urban hygiene. Amidst these hardships, immigrants demonstrated remarkable resilience by building vibrant communities in this dark, dank, smelly city. They often settled in ethnic enclaves, the Little Italies, Chinatowns, Jewish quarters, where they found familiar cultural elements and fellow nationals, offering a buffer against the prejudice of the wider society and a space to preserve their languages and traditions. Central to these communities were immigrant-led institutions. Mutual aid societies were lifelines. Irish Catholics had what they called the Ancient Order of Hibernius. Eastern European Jews established Landmannschaften, societies based on their own town of origin, with as many as 2,000 of these in New York City by 1910. These organizations provided crucial support, financial aid for illness or death, help starting businesses, and assistance with burial expenses. Remember, 1 out of 4 kids died before they were 1. They were, as one source puts it, extensions of communities, these mutual aid networks. Religious institutions, churches and synagogues, served as more than just places of worship. They were vital community hubs, quote, where families can gather, share experiences, and support one another, end quote. My grandfather, a Catholic, joined the Knights of Columbus. They offered, quote, comforts of familiar ritual and belief, and often material and spiritual aid, end quote. Many groups, like Irish Catholics, established parochial schools to educate their children and preserve their cultural and religious values in the face of a predominantly Protestant public school system. The foreign language press also played an indispensable role, acting as a, quote, conduit for cultural preservation, political mobilization, and community building. Newspapers in dozens of languages kept immigrants informed about their new country and their homelands, advertised community events and businesses, and helped them navigate American life while maintaining their cultural identity. However, the welcome from Americans was far from warm. Nativism, which is a fierce anti-immigrant sentiment, cast a long shadow. As one observer noted, quote, Americans began to associate many of the societal ills related to urbanization with the incoming immigrants, end quote. An old immigrant saying lamented, quote, America beckons, but Americans repel, end quote. Newcomers, particularly those from Southern and Eastern Europe and Asia, faced intense prejudice. They were blamed for the crime, disease, and economic problems of the city, and they were often stereotyped as racially inferior or politically dangerous, with fears that they held, quote, extremist views such as anarchism and communism, end quote. Sociologist Edward A. Ross, reflecting a common sentiment among the native-born Americans at the time, described the new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe as, quote, racially inferior. The blood now being injected into the veins of our people is subcommon, end quote. This prejudice culminated in discriminatory legislation, most notoriously the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This was the, quote, first significant law restricting immigration into the United States, end quote. And it was based on ethnicity, just being Chinese. And it barred Chinese laborers for 10 years, a ban that was repeatedly renewed and made permanent before it was finally repealed in 1943. The act also denied citizenship to Chinese people already residing in the United States, institutionalizing racism within federal immigration policy. The Gilded Age city, therefore, was a dynamic and often brutal place. It was here, amidst the squalor of the tenements and the sting of nativism, that diverse immigrant groups forged new lives, built communities, and began to weave their unique threads into this complex fabric of American identity. The sheer scale of urban problems, whether it was overcrowding or disease or poverty, simultaneously overwhelmed the existing systems of governance and forced the beginnings of modern urban planning, of public services, and a more active role for municipal authorities for the people living in those municipalities. This period laid the groundwork for a multicultural, multifaceted urban America we know today, and the tensions and triumphs experienced by these immigrant communities continue to resonate in contemporary debates about who's an American and what defines the nation. Let's turn our attention to the South. While the North and the West were being radically reshaped by industry and immigration, the South embarked on its own complex journey of transformation, or at least they attempted a transformation. In the aftermath of the Civil War and the collapse of Reconstruction, a new vision emerged, championed by figures like Atlanta newspaperman Henry W. Grady. This was the vision of what he called a New South, one that would shed its antebellum agrarian past, heavily reliant on cash crops like cotton, as well as heavily dependent on the institution of slavery, to embrace the North's model of industrialization, complete with factories, mines, and mills. In an influential 1888 speech, Grady proclaimed, quote, "There was a South of slavery and secession. That South is dead. There is a South of union and freedom. That South, thank God, is living, breathing, growing every hour." End quote. He painted a picture of this new South as having, quote, 100 farms for every plantation, 50 homes for every palace, and a diversified industry that meets the complex needs of this complex age, end quote. Grady's powerful rhetoric was aimed at attracting Northern investment and a signal that the South was ready to rejoin the nation economically. And although he said this was the place of union and freedom, freedom wasn't something that was extended to African Americans, a theme we will pick up on in future episodes. Some industrial progress did occur in the South. The textile industry specifically saw significant growth, with the number of cotton mills in the South expanding from 161 in 1880 to 400 by 1900. These mills were often located closer to raw cotton sources and benefiting from newer machinery and significantly lower labor costs, and they began to challenge New England's dominance of that industry. The tobacco industry was another area of Southern industrial might, largely due to the entrepreneurial and often ruthless tactics of James Buchanan Duke of North Carolina. Though mechanization, like the Bonsack cigarette rolling machine, and aggressive marketing and consolidation, Duke's American Tobacco Company came to control a staggering 90% of the U.S. tobacco market by 1889, mirroring the monopolistic practices of other Northern industrialists that we've talked about, men like Rockefeller or Carnegie. Birmingham, Alabama also emerged as a significant industrial hub. It came to be known as the Pittsburgh of the South, thanks to its rich deposits of coal and iron ore, which began its own iron and steel industry. However, the dream of a fully industrialized New South largely remained a dream. Despite these pockets of development, the region struggled to overcome its legacy of underdevelopment and poverty. By 1900, the per capita income in the South was still a mere 40% of the national average, and rural poverty remained deeply entrenched. Before the Civil War, the North already possessed 90% of the nation's manufacturing output, a gap the South found nearly impossible to close. Much of the New South's industry focused on low-wage, low-skill processing of its raw materials, textile, lumber, raw tobacco, rather than the more profitable, higher-value manufacturing that characterized Northern industry. Furthermore, the Southern economy often remained dependent on Northern capital, with Northern investors frequently controlling Southern resources and industries, extracting that wealth for Northern benefit. As late as 1890, only 10% of the Southern population lived in urban areas, compared to 26% in the North, indicating the continued dominance of agriculture on the Southern way of life. The progress that did occur in the New South was often built upon a foundation of extremely harsh labor conditions. Child labor was rampant, particularly in the textile mills. Mill owners often paid adult workers such meager wages that families had no choice but to send their children into the factories for the family to survive. One study found that between 1880 and 1910, roughly 1/4 of all cotton mill workers in the South were under the age of 16. These children, some as young as 9 or 10, typically entered full-time work by age 12, toiling for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for pennies. A contemporary minister recounted the heartbreaking sight of mill agents recruiting entire families from Appalachian mountain homes, these, quote, rosy-cheeked children among them, only to see some return later, quote, broken in health and spirits, their dreams shattered by the brutal reality of mill life. Even more horrific was the convict lease system, a practice that emerged after Reconstruction and served as a thinly veiled continuation of slavery. States leased out their prisoners from the jails, and the vast majority of them in the southern states were African American men arrested for minor and often fabricated offenses, and they were leased out to private companies. These convicts provided a cheap, coerced labor force for railroads, coal mines, iron furnaces, lumber camps, and plantations. The conditions were appalling. Prisoners were, quote, overworked, underfed, and abused, end quote. They were housed in squalid shanties and subjected to brutal discipline with high mortality rates from disease, malnutrition, and violence. Companies like the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company were major beneficiaries of this system. This dark heritage, as one scholar termed it, demonstrates how the New South's industrial ambitions were often intertwined with profound injustice and racial exploitation. This exploitation was part and parcel of a broader social reality, the re-entrenchment of white supremacy. The end of Reconstruction and the withdrawal of federal oversight paved the way for a systematic dismantling of black political and civil rights. Jim Crow laws grew, and they mandated racial segregation in every facet of public life, a system given the stamp of federal approval by the Supreme Court's 1896 decision, Plessy v. Ferguson, which famously established the doctrine of separate but equal. African Americans were systematically disenfranchised through a battery of measures, including poll taxes, literacy tests, property requirements, and grandfather clauses that effectively barred them from the ballot box across the South. Alongside legal and political disenfranchisement came the ever-present threat of racial violence in the South, most horrifically manifested in lynchings. Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was a courageous African-American journalist and activist, launched a one-woman crusade to expose lynching as what she termed, quote, our country's national crime, end quote. She meticulously documented lynchings and powerfully refuted the common white Southern justification that it was a necessary evil to protect white womanhood from alleged assaults by ravenous black men. Wells Barnett argued that this, quote, unwritten law was a pretext for racial terror and control. She wrote, quote, during the last 10 years, a new statute has been added to the unwritten law. This statute proclaims that for certain crimes or alleged crimes, no Negro shall be allowed a trial. The result is that many men have been put to death whose innocence was afterwards established, end quote. She also detailed the gruesome natures of these public spectacles. Quote, the 19th century lynching mob cuts off ears, toes, and fingers, strips off flesh, and distributes portions of the bodies as souvenirs among the crowd, end quote. Her fearless reporting brought international attention to these atrocities. This was extramartial violence, violence outside the law. Men and women denied the constitutional protection of due process under the law. This oppressive environment, African American leaders grappled with what was the best path forward, and this led to a profound and enduring debate most famously articulated by Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Washington, in his 1895 Atlanta Compromise speech, advocated for economic self-help, vocational industrial training as practiced at his Tuskegee Institute, and a strategy of accommodation to segregation in return for economic opportunities. He urged black Southerners to, quote, cast down your bucket where you are. And he famously stated, quote, in all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress, end quote. For Washington, quote, the opportunity to earn $1 in a factory just now is worth indefinitely more than the opportunity to spend $1 in an opera house, end quote. On the other side of the debate, we have W.E.B. Du Bois, and in his seminal 1903 work, The Souls of Black Folk, he sharply criticized Washington's approach as, quote, the old attitude of adjustment and submission, end quote. Du Bois argued that Washington's program, quote, practically accepts the alleged inferiority of the Negro races, end quote. And it asked black people to give up political power, insistence on their civil rights, and access to higher education for their youth. Instead, Du Bois championed the idea of the talented 10th, a cadre of college-educated black leaders, and demanded immediate and full political and civil rights, as well as access to higher liberal arts education. He powerfully questioned, quote, "Is it possible and probable that 9 millions of men can make effective progress in economic lines if they are deprived of political rights, made a servile caste, and allowed only the most meager chance of developing their exceptional men?" End quote. This fundamental disagreement over strategy, accommodation, and economic focus versus agitation and ripe space demands would echo through the civil rights movement for decades to come. The New South, then, was far from a straightforward story of progress that Grady himself envisioned. It was a region of deep contradictions where attempts at industrial modernization occurred alongside, and were often built upon, the reassertion of a brutal racial hierarchy and exploitative labor system that bore a disturbing resemblance to the Old South. The promise of a South of union and freedom clashed starkly with the lived reality of Jim Crow, of disenfranchisement, and of racial terror, and it created a complex and contested landscape for all its inhabitants, especially for African Americans. One of the most striking social developments of the era was the emergence of the New Woman. This was a term used to describe a generation of women coming of age roughly between 1890 and 1920 who, quote, challenged traditional gender norms and structures by asserting a new public presence through work, education, entertainment, and politics, end quote. The New Woman was associated with the burgeoning feminist movement, the fight for women's suffrage, a growing engagement with consumer culture, and often freer expressions of their sexuality. What fueled this new femininity was expanding opportunities brought on by the new industrialized world. More women were attending college, and by 1900, over 5 million women worked outside of the home. While many working-class women, particularly the young and single immigrants, they toiled in dangerous factories for low wages and long hours, a growing number of single middle-class women found employment as secretaries, store clerks, teachers, and nurses. The popular Gibson Girl, an illustration by Charles Dana Gibson, became an iconic image of this new woman, young, white, single, often athletic, cycling was a popular pastime at this time period, and they assertively navigating the new social world. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's powerful short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, published in 1892, became a searing critique of the medical and societal oppression faced by women, particularly concerning their mental health and intellectual autonomy. Gilman later explained that she wrote it, quote, not intended to drive people crazy, but to save people from being driven crazy, and it worked, end quote. The spirit of independence was also captured by women like Eleanor Pruitt Stewart, a homesteader. We've talked about her in the West. And she wrote, quote, any woman who can stand her own company will certainly succeed out West. They will have independence, plenty to eat at all time, and a home for their own in the end, end quote. And it reflected this broader desire for autonomy, not just in cities, but out in the country as well. Simultaneously, traditional religious beliefs face unprecedented challenges. The publication of Charles Darwin's theories of evolution, particularly on the origin of species, directly conflicted with literal interpretations of Bible creation and the concept of divinely ordained and ordered, unchanging world. By the 1870s, American religious leaders and thinkers were intensely debating the theological implications of Darwinism. Figures like the evangelist Dwight L. Moody denounced Darwinism as a profound threat to biblical truth and public morality. This intellectual ferment contributed to a growing split between American Protestantism, between modernists who sought to reconcile faith with new scientific understandings, and fundamentalists who insisted on the literal inerrancy or the unerrability of Scripture. Adding another layer to this was social Darwinism, which was a controversial ideology that misapplied Darwin's biological concepts of natural selection and survival of the fittest. And survival of the fittest is a term coined by the sociologist Herbert Spencer and not Darwin himself. But it was applying this to human society that creates social Darwinism. Social Darwinists argued that wealth and social standing were indicators of inherent fitness, thus justifying the era's vast economic inequalities and often promoting racist and eugenicist ideas. These are all things I explained in a previous episode. It was used against arguing for government aid to the poor, as poverty was seen as a sign of natural inferiority, not a policy decision. However, not all religious responses to the era's challenges were defensive or reactionary. The social gospel movement emerged as a powerful force, arguing that the, quote, kingdom of God as requiring social as well as individual salvation, end quote, and that the Christian principles of charity and justice should be applied to solve the problems of industrialized society. Led by influential liberal Protestant ministers like Washington Gladden and Walter Rauschenbusch, the social gospel advocated for significant labor reforms, including the abolition of child labor, a shorter work week, a living wage, and factory regulation. This movement also inspired the creation of settlement houses, like Jane Addams' Hull House in Chicago, which provided essential services and advocated for the urban poor and immigrants. The social gospel represented a profound effort to make faith relevant to the pressing social ills of the Gilded Age and laid important groundwork for the progressive era reforms we'll see in a later episode. As working hours gradually, and albeit slowly, decreased for some segments of the population, the average work week actually fell from around 66 hours of work in 1860 to 60 hours by 1890. New forms of mass culture and leisure emerged to fill this time. Amusement parks became a sensation, with Coney Island being the model in New York leading the way. Parks like Steeplechase Park opened in 1897 and Luna Park in 1903 offered thrilling roller coaster rides, dazzling electric light displays, exotic shows, and a taste of modern technological marvels, and they provided an escape from the grime and the routine of city life. Vaudeville became the most popular form of urban family entertainment, offering a diverse bill of, quote, 10 to 15 individual unrelated acts, featuring magicians, acrobats, comedians, trained animals, jugglers, singers, and dancers, end quote. Tony Pastor is credited with popularizing, quote, straight, clean variety shows that appealed to a broader audience. Spectator sports also exploded in popularity. Baseball in this time period cemented its status as the national pastime with the formation of the National League in 1876, and large grandstand stadiums were built in major cities. College football developed a massive following, despite its often brutal nature, while boxing gained a measure of respectability with the introduction of gloves and the Marquis of Queensberry rules. James Naismith invented basketball in 1891, providing an exciting indoor sport for the winter months. So these cultural shifts were profound. The rigid social norms of the Victorian era were clearly eroding under the pressures and opportunities of an industrialized urban society. But they also birthed new anxieties, particularly around traditional concepts of masculinity in an industrial world where physical prowess might seem less valued. And it also coexisted with the excitement of new freedoms and forms of expression. The new woman was both a product of new opportunities and it was a challenge to old constraints. Religion was forced to grapple with scientific advancements, leading to diverse responses from staunch defense of tradition to calls for social action. And the rise of a mass culture provided new shared experiences that began to form a more national, if not entirely unified, popular consciousness, offering an escape from and a reflection of the rapidly changing times. The industrialized city also had a profound impact on politics and a new form of political power that emerged in this time period, the urban political machine. These organizations, often associated with a particular party, wielded immense influence, particularly over the immigrant communities. Perhaps the most notorious of these was Tammany Hall, the Democratic Party machine that dominated New York City politics for decades. They were led by powerful bosses like the infamous William M. Tweed, known as Boss Tweed, and Tammany Hall controlled nominations, patronage, and ultimately votes. The machine's power was built on a system of direct personal engagement with constituents, especially newly arrived immigrants who were often bewildered by their new surroundings and desperate for some sort of assistance. Ward bosses, or ward healers as they were known, were the foot soldiers of the system, acting as local vote gatherers and, crucially, as providers of patronage and aid. Journalist William Reardon, in his 1905 book Plunkett of Tammany Hall, provided a remarkable inside look at the machine through the words of one such ward boss, George Washington Plunkett. Plunkett candidly described his philosophy of what he called honest graft. Quote, "Everybody is talking these days about Tammany men growing rich on graft," Plunkett is quoted, "but nobody thinks of drawing the distinction between honest graft and dishonest graft. There's all the difference in the world between the two. There's an honest graft, and I'm an example of how it works. I might sum up the whole thing by saying, I see my opportunities and I took them," end quote. His examples of honest graft included using insider information to buy land where a new park or bridge approach was planned, then selling it to the city at a handsome profit. He famously concluded, quote, "If my worst enemy was given the job of writing my epitaph when I'm gone, he couldn't do more than write George W. Plunkett. He's seen his opportunities and he took them," end quote. Plunkett's honest graft was distinct in his view from dishonest graft, like blackmail or direct theft from the city treasury. Yet the line was often blurry, and the Tweed ring, for instance, was legendary for raking in millions through inflated contracts and kickbacks. The construction of the New York City courthouse, for example, became a symbol of this excess, with costs ballooning to many times the original estimates due to the fraudulent billing. Despite this pervasive corruption, political machines like Tammany Hall endured because they actually provided tangible benefits to immigrant communities when other institutions did not. As Plunkett's daily routine chronicled by Reardon, and it illustrates that ward bosses were constantly at work, bailing constituents out of jail, finding homes for families after fires, securing jobs for unemployed immigrants, attending funerals, weddings, even church socials. In short, acting as a rudimentary social service agent. Tammany helped immigrants find the things they needed: housing. They also provided money for food and coal in the winter. They assisted with medical care and even aided in the naturalization process to become citizens, which was key to securing the votes of the people they were helping. In a city lacking comprehensive public welfare, the political machines filled this critical void, earning the loyalty and votes of thousands who saw these political machines as their advocates and their protectors. However, this aid came at a steep price, and it wasn't just for the votes. You could vote for them, but the corruption behind it was endemic. Jobs in city government were distributed based on patronage and loyalty, not on the merit of the person applying for the job. Elections were routinely manipulated through tactics like hiring people to vote multiple times, known as repeaters, stuffing ballot boxes with fraudulent votes, and bribing or intimidating election inspectors. Boss Tweed himself reportedly boasted, quote, "The ballots made no result. The counters made the result," end quote. This system, of course, did not go unchallenged. Reformers and crusaders and crusading journalists worked to expose the corruption in the political machines. Among the most effective critics was the cartoonist Thomas Nast, whose scathing illustrations in Harper's Weekly relentlessly showed Boss Tweed and the Tammany Hall ring as corrupt. Nast depicted Tweed as an enormously bloated figure, a greedy emperor, and the Tammany Tiger as a vicious predator devouring people in the city. Because many of Tweed's constituents were illiterate, NAS images were powerful visual attacks, and they were particularly damaging. Even though you couldn't read, you could understand the pictures even if you couldn't read the articles behind them condemning the machine. Tweed himself recognized the threat, reportedly exclaiming, quote, "Stop them damn pictures," end quote, and even attempted to bribe NAS into silence. NAS' campaign played a significant role in turning public opinion against Boss Tweed, contributing to the ring's downfall in 1871 election and Tweed's eventual imprisonment. The rise of political machines was in many ways a direct consequence of the challenges of governing this rapidly growing, diverse, and often chaotic Gilded Age cities. Existing municipal structures after the war were frequently overwhelmed and ill-equipped to handle the influx of immigrants and the demand for basic services across the city. And it's into this void that machines like Tammany Hall and others emerged, providing a form of informal and often corrupt and exploitative governance. They met real needs, but in doing so, they often undermined the rule of law and fair democratic processes. The struggle against machine politics and urban corruption became a central theme of the progressive era that followed, as reformers sought to create a more efficient, professional, and honest city governments, often by expanding the very public services that machines once monopolized. Andrew Carnegie, a titan of this age, celebrated the dynamism of this era when he proclaimed, quote, "The conditions of human life have not only been changed but revolutionized. This change, however, is not to be deplored, but welcomed as highly beneficial," end quote. His triumph of America was a narrative of progress, of a nation thundering past its global peers. Yet, this gilded surface, as we have seen, concealed a different reality for millions. Jacob Riis showed us that, showed us how immigrants were crammed into squalor. Ida B. Wells Barnett showed us that too, exposing the savagery of lynch law and a brutal counterpoint to any claims of a civilized New South. And the voices of the child laborers in southern mills and the exploited men in convict lease gangs tell a story far removed from Carnegie's triumphant vision. The unresolved agonies of Reconstruction, particularly the failure to secure lasting racial equality and economic justice in the South, echoed loudly throughout this period. The labor movements, whose early stirrings we've previously discussed, now face colossal corporations and new forms of industrial discipline, leading to more bitterness and more violent confrontations. And the conquest of the West, this concurrent national project, was deeply intertwined with this industrial expansion. It supplied the raw materials, the markets, and a potent national myth of expanding progress and opportunity, even as it meant tragedy for the displacement of Native American populations. It was in 1893, at the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition, itself a dazzling display of industrial and technological might, that we first heard Frederick Jackson Turner famously declare that the American frontier was closed. This pronouncement that the frontier has gone, and gone with it has closed the first period of American history, coincided with the peak of industrialization and urbanization, creating a sense that America was entering a new, more complex, and perhaps more uncertain chapter. The Gilded Age, then, was not just a period of economic and technological change. It was an era that forged modern America, complete with its incredible dynamism, its innovative spirit, its diverse population, but also its enduring fault lines. The questions that burned so intensely in those decades about the nature of progress, the distribution of wealth, the role of government, the power of corporations, the challenges of immigration, the meaning of equality, and the very soul of a nation are questions that, in many ways, we are still grappling with today. Thanks for joining me today on Star-Spangled Studies, and I'll see y'all in the past.